Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We are about to unpack something really, really fascinating today.
hmm
We're diving deep into the legal foundations of movement. This is episode 109, and we're working with a fantastic stack of material you sent in, all drawn from the book True Courtroom Stories, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir.
And that context is so important. We're not just talking about abstract philosophy today.
Yeah, not at all.
We're talking about principles that have been forged in, actual court battles. The material gives us this incredible four-layered model for understanding the right to move.
Right. It's like a legal shield with 4 layers of protection. We've got this foundational principle, then a global standard, an Islamic legal tradition, and finally a national constitutional law.
And our mission today is to see how they all connect, how they reinforce each other to protect one fundamental human truth.
And the best part is we don't have to search for that truth. The source material gives it to us right up front. It's the unifying idea, the what they call the ratio.
The legal bedrock for everything else we're going to discuss.
Exactly. And if there's one thing you take away from our deep dive today, it should be this single statement. Liberty is the rule, restriction the exception.
That phrase it's the starting line for everything.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating is just how universal that concept is. Every framework we're about to look at, from global human rights law to Pakistan's constitution, it all serves to uphold and define the boundaries of that simple rule.
It's powerful because it just completely inverts how we normally think about state power, doesn't it?
It really does.
The idea isn't that the state grants you permission to move. The idea is that you are born with the right to move, and the state has to come up with a very, very good reason to stop you.
The burden of proof is entirely on them.
Let's start right there. Let's unpack that foundational ratio.
Let's do it.
So this core principle, liberty is the rule, restriction the exception. Let's spend some real time on the philosophical weight of that. Why is liberty the default? Why does the law start there?
Well, at its deepest level, it connects directly to the idea of human dignity, to autonomy. If you start with the premise that humans are not just, cogs in a machine, but are agents who can make moral choices, then the ability to physically move is the most basic expression of that agency.
Without it, nothing else really works.
Nothing. Think about it. All the other freedoms we talk about, freedom of speech, religion, economic opportunity, they become almost meaningless if you're physically confined.
Yeah.
You can't go to the market, you can't go to the mosque, you can't meet with people to protest. Mobility is the oxygen for all other rights.
And that philosophical idea translates into a very real legal advantage in the courtroom.
A huge advantage.
So if liberty is the rule, the state's lawyer walks into the courtroom already on the back foot. They are, in a sense, already losing the argument.
Precisely. We call it the inversion of presumption. Normally, we might presume a government action is valid, but here, the law presumes freedom. The authority, whether it's the police, an administrative agency, whoever, they start at zero. They have to build a case from scratch to justify their restriction.
I'm thinking of an analogy, like a computer's default settings. The system is set to allow all traffic.
That's a great analogy.
And to block something, to create a restriction, you need the administrator password. You have to actively and deliberately invoke an exception.
And that password, in legal terms, is the very strict test of necessity, proportionality, and legitimate aim. It's not just about blatant things like, closing a border.
Right.
The principle applies to more subtle restrictions, too. For example, creating a system of surveillance so pervasive that people are afraid to travel to certain places. That functionally restricts movement.
Or just making it bureaucratically impossible to get a passport.
Exactly. The delay, the red tape, it has the same effect as a ban. So in one of these true courtroom stories, say a person is challenging a travel ban. Their lawyer's job isn't to prove why they should be allowed to travel.
No, their job is just to poke holes in the state's reasoning.
Their only job is to show the state hasn't met its burden of proof. The entire onus is on the government to prove that the ban was absolutely necessary.
And that word necessary is doing a lot of work there. It's not just helpful or convenient for the state.
Not at all. It's a rigorous legal term.
Yeah.
Necessary implies that there was no less restrictive way to achieve the goal. If the state could have solved the problem with, say, targeted monitoring instead of a blanket ban, then the ban wasn't necessary.
And if it wasn't necessary?
It's automatically invalid. The ratio dictates it.
Okay, let's push on that a little bit. Because in the real world, a government can just say the magic words, right? They can say national security or public order. Doesn't the court, in practice, just kind of defer to the government on that? Doesn't this powerful ratio sometimes just crumble under that pressure?
That is the constant struggle. It's the central tension. But a judiciary that's doing its job correctly understands that the ratio was designed specifically to prevent that kind of collapse.
So they can't just take the government's word for it.
No. The court's role is to scrutinize the claim, to demand evidence. If the government says national security, the judge has to ask, okay, show me the link. Show me precisely how this person's travel is a threat to the entire nation's security. A vague, hand-waving argument isn't enough.
So the judge is really asking two very deep questions. First, is this restriction actually serving a legitimate state interest?
And is that interest compelling enough?
And second, was the amount of freedom you took away proportionate to the amount of safety you gained?
That's the proportionality test. It's crucial. If a restriction is just too broad, if it affects, a million innocent people just to stop one potential threat, it fails the test.
It's out of balance.
Completely. If the state uses, say, preventative detention for years for an offense that would only carry a 6-month sentence, that fails the proportionality test. The ratio is a tool that forces the government to be precise, to be restrained, and to justify every single deviation from the norm of freedom.
So if liberty is the rule, we have to look at the other side of the coin. What qualifies as a legitimate exception? We know it has to be necessary and proportionate, but what are the sort of accepted categories?
Generally, they fall into a handful of very specific, well-defined buckets. The most common ones you'll see are, first, public health crises.
Like quarantines during a pandemic, that makes sense.
Second would be genuine national security threats, restricting access to an active military zone, for instance.
Okay.
Third is public order. This one is tricky and gets scrutinized a lot, but it could mean targeted restrictions to prevent an imminent riot.
Very specific and very immediate.
It has to be. And the fourth is judicial mandates, things like bail conditions, where a court orders you not to leave the city, or a restraining order.
The common thread here seems to be specificity. The exception can't be some vague, undefined threat.
It cannot. And critically, the exception can never be allowed to swallow the rule.
What do you mean by that?
If the exceptions become so common or so broad, or they last forever, then restriction isn't the exception anymore. It's become the new rule. And at that point, the fundamental right has been functionally erased.
That's the slippery slope.
That's the entire game, and that's why the courts act as the gatekeeper. Any valid restriction has to be temporary, it has to be transparent, and it has to be subject to constant legal review. You have to be able to go back to court and say, is this still necessary?
So if a court allows a government to restrict movement based on a vague idea like, say, preserving public morality, without defining what that even means,
then the state has just been handed a blank check. They've been given unlimited power. A court that applies the ratio correctly would immediately reject such a broad justification. The restriction has to be defined in a law that's passed by Parliament, not just some executive order.
and the moment the reason for the exception disappears.
The liberty snaps back into place. Automatically. The pandemic ends, the investigation is over, the war zone is safe, the default setting of freedom is restored. That's what makes the ratio so revolutionary. It forces the state to constantly, day after day, justify its power.
Okay, so we've got this powerful philosophical and legal bedrock. But how does this idea of liberty as the rule hold up when we zoom out? Let's go to that global layer now, because the source material points out that this isn't just one country's idea. It's a global consensus written into international human rights law.
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting.
We see this global convergence.
We do. International law gives us a universal vocabulary for this principle. It confirms that this isn't just a product of, one specific legal culture. It's recognized everywhere as a fundamental human entitlement.
So what are the key documents here? Where is this ratio written down on the global stage?
The two big ones are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR.
The UDHR is the foundational one, right? The aspirational one.
It is. Article 13. It's beautiful in its simplicity.
Yeah.
It just says everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within their own state, and the right to leave any country, including their own, and to return to their country.
So that covers both sides of the border, moving around inside and the right to get out and come back.
Exactly. And then the ICCPR, which is a binding treaty that countries ratify, it takes that principle and turns it into hard law. Article 12 of the ICCPR is basically the global definition of restriction, the exception.
Okay, so break that down for us. What does it say?
It says that the right to movement can't be restricted except when those restrictions are, 1, provided by law,
Meaning no arbitrary orders?
right? 2, they must be necessary to protect national security, public order, public health or morals, or the rights of others.
There's that word necessary again.
Always. And 3, they have to be consistent with all the other rights in the treaty.
So you can't protect public order by, say, violating the right to freedom of expression at the same time.
You've got it. That's the global proportionality test, laid out right there. Every single one of those conditions has to be met. It's not a checklist where you can pick and choose.
Let's run a hypothetical through that test. A new infectious disease appears. A government wants to issue a total indefinite ban on its own citizens returning home from an affected region. How would international law view that?
A domestic court, guided by the international standard, would almost certainly find that the ban fails the necessity test.
Why? It seems like it would protect public health.
It might, but remember the test. Is it the least restrictive means available? Are there other options?
Well, yeah, you could have mandatory testing on arrival.
You could have supervised quarantine for a limited period. You could have contact tracing.
So a total ban is overkill. It's not proportionate.
It's rarely proportionate, especially when it comes to your own citizens. The right to return to one's own country is one of the most highly protected rights in the entire system. A blanket ban is a sledgehammer when a scalpel is available.
This brings us to a really practical point. How does a treaty signed in Geneva or New York actually make its way into a local courtroom? How does it help someone in one of these courtroom stories?
It's a key feature of modern law. International law serves as a powerful interpretive tool.
What does that mean, an interpretive tool?
It means that if a domestic law is ambiguous, if a national security law could be read in 2 different ways, one that's very restrictive and one that's more protective of liberty, the judge is expected to choose the interpretation that aligns with the country's international obligations.
So it's like a tiebreaker, and the tie always goes to liberty.
It's a judicial rudder, pushing the interpretation of the law back towards the foundational ratio. It acts as a floor, a minimum standard of protection that the domestic law can't fall below.
And what about in a real crisis, a state of emergency? Can't a government just suspend all these rights?
They can, but even that power is strictly limited under international law. The technical term is derogation. A country can temporarily suspend certain rights during a declared emergency that threatens the life of the nation.
But not all rights.
Not all rights, and the suspension itself has to be proportional. It can only last as long as the emergency does, and it can't be discriminatory. And as we said, some rights, like the right to return home, are considered so fundamental that they're almost impossible to suspend.
So even in the worst-case scenario, international law provides this crucial check and balance.
It prevents a government from using an emergency as a pretext to, say, permanently exile political opponents. It holds national actions accountable to a universal standard, giving the individual in that courtroom one more powerful layer of defense.
So from the global, we now move to a very specific and very deep legal tradition. The next pillar in our source material is the Islamic legal principle, which is summarized beautifully as travel restrictions only by law.
And this is such a critical layer to add. It shows that the core ideas we've been discussing, liberty as the norm, the rejection of arbitrary power, these are just modern Western concepts. They have deep roots in diverse legal and philosophical traditions.
The phrase itself, only by law, sounds so modern. It sounds like something out of a modern constitution.
It does. It's the historical equivalent of the rule of law. It's a clear statement that the power to restrict a person's movement doesn't belong to an individual ruler's whim. It belongs to the law itself, which should be stable, known, and applied equally.
So before modern states and passports, what was the general attitude towards travel and mobility in classical Islamic tradition? Was it seen as a good thing?
It was seen as not just good, but often essential. Travel, or safar, was fundamental to the health of the community for several key reasons.
Okay, like what?
First and foremost, for trade. The economy depended on merchants moving freely and safely. Second, for religious obligations. The Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, is a mandatory pillar of the faith. That requires travel.
And you can't have a mandatory pillar that's impossible to perform.
Precisely. The system must facilitate that movement. And third, and this is a really beautiful concept, for seeking knowledge to love all ilm. There was a celebrated tradition of scholars and students traveling thousands of miles to learn from different masters.
So the default state for a thriving society, economically, spiritually, intellectually, was mobility.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which fits perfectly with our foundational ratio. Liberty is the rule, and therefore any restriction must be the exception, and that exception must be by law.
Let's dig into that phrase, by law. What does that mean in this context?
It means the restriction has to be based on clear, established legal principles. It can't be a secret decree. It can't be the whim of a local governor who's having a bad day. The legal reason for the restriction has to be transparent and traceable back to a legitimate source, whether that's scripture or a state statute that's consistent with it.
As a guardrail against tyranny.
It's a fundamental guardrail. It means the law is the master, not the ruler. It's about accountability.
So how does this connect to the higher objectives of the law? You've mentioned before the idea of the maqasid al-sharia.
Yes, this is where it all ties together beautifully. The maqasid are the ultimate goals of Islamic law. They are traditionally understood as the protection of 5 essential things: life, religion, intellect, family, and property.
Okay, so let's connect the dots. How does freedom of movement protect those 5 things?
Let's take property. You can't engage in trade or protect your assets if you can't travel. Restricting movement harms property rights.
Makes sense.
Intellect. As we said, the tradition of traveling for knowledge is central. Restricting movement harms intellectual growth. Religion, obviously, with the Hajj. But what about life?
I would think restricting movement could protect life, like a quarantine.
Exactly, and that's a perfect example of a legitimate exception by law. A quarantine is a restriction on movement, but its legal justification is the protection of life, which is a higher objective. The same goes for restricting travel to a dangerous war zone. The restriction serves a clear, legally recognized purpose.
So the restriction isn't arbitrary. It's justified by its service to one of these core principles.
That's the key. It has to be based on preventing a definite harm, and it must be done according to a clear legal process.
The harmony here is just. It's striking. The Islamic principle, travel restrictions only by law, is just another way of saying liberty is the rule, restriction the exception.
It's a different vocabulary for the same fundamental concept. And this convergence is what makes the argument for freedom of movement so incredibly powerful, especially in a legal system that draws from multiple traditions.
It adds another layer of defense.
It multiplies the layers.
Yeah.
An individual in court can argue that a restriction violates the modern Constitution, it violates international law, and it violates this deep foundational religious legal principle of the rule of law. It makes the state's case for arbitrary power exceptionally difficult to win.
And that brings us perfectly to our final layer. This is where we bring all of these principles, the philosophical, the global, the traditional, crashing down to earth, to the point of enforcement.
To the law in the books.
Exactly. We're now at the national application, Pakistan, Article 15. This is the clause in the Constitution that takes all this theory and makes it a concrete, enforceable right for every citizen.
And putting it in the Constitution is the most powerful statement a country can make.
Yeah.
It means this isn't just a regular law that a government can change when it feels like it. It's a fundamental right. It's part of the nation's DNA.
So let's get specific. What does Article 15 actually guarantee?
It guarantees 2 key things for every citizen. First, the freedom of movement throughout the entire country. And second, the right to reside and settle in any part of it.
So you have the right to travel anywhere within Pakistan and the right to choose where you want to live.
Yes. It's the legal basis for national unity, for economic integration. It means someone from one province has the right to move to another for a job or for education.
And following the pattern we've seen, this article must also define the exception to the rule.
Of course, it has to. Article 15 says the right can be restricted by law, but only when it's in the public interest.
And those words, in the public interest, sound very broad.
They are. And that's precisely why the role of the courts is so absolutely critical. Without a strong, independent judiciary to interpret what that phrase means, it could be abused by the state to justify almost anything.
So let's imagine some of these true courtroom stories. What are some real-world situations where a citizen would need to stand up in court and invoke Article 15?
You see a whole range of cases. A classic one is what's called internal exile, where the government orders a person to stay within a certain district or forbids them from entering it, often without any formal criminal charges.
So they're a prisoner in their own town.
Effectively. You also see challenges to policies that create arbitrary hurdles for people trying to move and settle in a new province. Or cases challenging the seizure of ID cards or passports without a court order, which makes movement impossible.
Even things like excessive security checkpoints. If they're set up in a way that seems to target one group of people and makes their daily travel a nightmare.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That could be challenged as a disproportionate burden on the freedom of movement guaranteed by Article 15. In every one of these cases, the citizen holds up Article 15, and the state has to prove that its actions were a reasonable and necessary restriction in the public interest.
Which brings us to the judges. How do they actually perform that balancing act?
The Supreme Court and the high courts have developed a rigorous process of judicial review. They don't just accept the state's claim of public interest, they put it through a multi-part test.
Okay, what's in that test?
First, the restriction has to be based on an actual clear law. No ad hoc decisions. It connects right back to the Islamic principle, only by law.
Right.
Second, there must be a rational nexus, a logical connection between the restriction and the public interest it's supposed to protect. A roadblock in one city doesn't protect public health in another. Third is the necessity test again. Was this the least restrictive way to achieve the goal? If not, it fails. And fourth is proportionality. The harm done to the individual's liberty cannot be wildly out of proportion to the public good that is gained.
The sledgehammer and the nut.
It always comes back to that. If the state is using a massive, indefinite restriction to solve a small, temporary problem, a court applying this test will strike it down as unconstitutional under Article 15.
This is where the whole stack really comes together, isn't it?
This is the moment of synthesis. Let's take a specific courtroom story. A provincial government claiming a vague public security risk seals its borders to all citizens from a neighboring province.
Okay.
A person who just lost their job because of this ban challenges it in court under Article 15. The judge doesn't just look at Article 15 in a vacuum. They look at it through the lens of all four layers we've discussed.
So walk me through the judge's thought process.
First, the judge starts with the ratio. Liberty is the rule. The province must justify this exceptional restriction. Second, the Islamic principle. Was this ban enacted through a proper, transparent law, or was it just an executive order? Third, the global standard. Did this total ban meet the strict necessity test from international law, or could they have used less restrictive means like targeted security checks? Almost certainly they could have. And finally, Article 15. Is this blanket ban, which harms thousands of people's livelihoods, truly a proportional response to a vague security threat?
The answer is almost certainly no.
Almost certainly. By applying all these layers, the court has a robust framework to push back against state overreach. It shows the incredible value of having this layered legal protection. Article 15 becomes the national gateway through which all this legal history and global consensus flows to protect the individual.
So the person standing in that courtroom is protected by more than just that one article.
They're protected by a legal tradition that spans centuries and continents, all of which insists on one thing. Freedom is the starting point.
So to wrap this up, this deep dive has really illuminated how one single right, the right to move, is shielded by this amazing stack of legal traditions.
Mutually reinforcing traditions.
Let's just quickly recap the four pillars one last time.
First, we had the philosophical bedrock, that fundamental ratio. Liberty is the rule, restriction the exception. That sets the entire stage.
Second, we had the global standard from international human rights law, which gives us the universal tests for necessity and proportionality. It's the minimum standard every country should meet.
Third was the Islamic convergence, the principle that restrictions must be only by law. This reinforces the rule of law and rejects arbitrary power from a deep historical and traditional perspective.
And finally, the national enforcement mechanism, Pakistan's Article 15. This is what takes all that high-level principle and makes it a real enforceable right in a courtroom.
And the message for you listening to this is that your right to move isn't fragile. It's not a gift from the government. It's a profoundly protected right, defended by overlapping layers of philosophy, religion, global consensus, and national law.
But the crucial lesson, coming from a book called True Courtroom Stories, is that these rights don't defend themselves.
Not at all. They are not self-executing. They have to be asserted. They have to be fought for in court, case by case. The system only stays honest if the judiciary remains vigilant in applying these tests, always, always leaning in favor of liberty.
And on that note, we have to end with a final thought, because the way states can restrict us is evolving.
It's evolving faster than the law in some cases.
Exactly. We've spent this entire time talking about physical barriers, checkpoints, borders, travel bans. That's what the law has traditionally called a restriction.
Right.
But if the foundational rule is restriction is the exception, we have to ask a question about the future. What happens when the state doesn't need a physical barrier to stop you?
That is the 21st century challenge.
If modern technology allows for pervasive digital surveillance or mandatory location tracking on your phone, if it makes free movement feel watched, regulated, even dangerous, has the state imposed a restriction even without a single roadblock?
If the psychological effect is the same, if you stop traveling to certain places or meeting with certain people because you know every move is being tracked, has your liberty been restricted just as effectively as if there were a wall in front of you?
Does the digital age demand a new definition of restriction, one that includes these technological or psychological barriers, in order to keep that foundational rule of liberty alive?
Does the right to free movement now imply a right to anonymous movement?
Something to think about until our next deep dive. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your sources.
It was a pleasure. I can't wait to see what you send us next.